Streaming bandwidth provided by worship channels. Live streaming made simple. Visit them online at worshipchannels.com. On today's Tech Help for Churches, what to do if your domain is taken. Well, welcome everyone again to another episode of Tech Help for Churches. I, of course, am your host, Paul Allen Clifford. Now, if this is the only show in the network that you watch or listen to, you might not know that last week I was gone for about half the week. My church had their annual leadership retreat, which we've renamed Leadership Advance because we want to advance, not retreat. Anyway, so I had a great time away, met Jesus in some great ways, and maybe we'll talk about that on an upcoming show. Don't forget, if you want to contact me, drop me a line, paul@trinitydigitalmedia.com. Head on over to the live stream at churchtechcast.com, and you can participate in the chat. This show records every week, Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. You could also give me a call, 1-877-763-3246. I may or may not be having some issues with that number, by the way. If you have been calling and you haven't gotten any response, I keep getting 10 seconds of silence. So I'm still looking into that. So if you have been calling and participating in that way, and all of a sudden you find that I'm just not responding to you, sorry about that. I'm trying to figure out if it's the case that no one's leaving a message, or if it's the case that the service isn't recording the messages. So if that's you, drop me a line. You can also follow me on Twitter at Paul Allen Cliff. That's PaulAlanclif. So let's get into our topic, shall we? Now, when I say your domain is taken, what I mean is not that you had it and then you lost it, although I guess that's absolutely a possibility, but it's also the case that there are a large number of First Baptist churches. I mean, huge. There's even a good number of Second Baptist and Main Street Presbyterian, and there are a lot of churches with the same name, just in different cities. So if you were thinking, oh, I'll just get mainstreetpresbyterian.org, probably not going to happen. .coms, .nets, .orgs, .tvs, those are, well, it's kind of like a land rush. So with that in mind, how do you get past this problem? Well, one thing that you could do is you could just make your name longer. So there's no reason whatsoever that you couldn't go with First Baptist Church, Lexington, Kentucky, where love is the key.com. You could do that. I wouldn't, because that's so long that it's going to take forever for people to type it out. So let's look at some other alternatives, shall we? Think about all the possibilities of your name for your church. And I want you to think, let's start with .com and .org. .com meaning just that it was supposed to be only for-profit companies, but it's just become the default. So that's always worth checking. Chances are it's going to be more taken since it's the default. But then .org. So I own paulclifford.org, and part of that is because the guy that owns paulclifford.com isn't even using it. It's a British guy. I'm working through some forgiveness on that. But I went with .org, and that solved my problem. So think about perhaps going from .org to .com or .com to .org would be a good way to do it. Another possibility is think of all the things that you call your church. So my church is Quest Community Church, and we own questcommunity.com. So Quest Community works perfectly fine. It's like a shortened version. But we also call our church QCC. Now, as it turns out, there are a lot of QCCs. But what if you had a particularly odd name? What if, well, this isn't particularly odd for a church, but what if you had Zion in the name of your church? That's a Z. That's not a very common letter in the alphabet. It's possible that ZAME.org isn't taken. So that would be Zion African Methodist Episcopal. So that's something else that you could do. So think of abbreviations. Think of abbreviating each word in the name. So again, going back to our example, if it's an African Methodist Episcopal Church, maybe Zion AME isn't taken. So you have both of those as possibilities. So your next question, beyond what other names can you call your church, are what extensions are you willing to go with? So a URL shortener service that I use is bit.ly, bit.ly. Now, bit.ly is actually a Libyan domain. So it's a country code for Libya. It's possible that you could find a country code that would be helpful to you as a church. And it's kind of because the .coms are getting mostly used up and the .orgs are not far behind them, the .net's not as much, so you can start and think through, could I use a country code? Am I willing to go with .net versus .com or .org? I'd avoid .biz. It's not very widely used. There are a lot of extensions that really aren't good. But if you can do like live streaming, .tv, which although more expensive, still we're talking the difference between $10 a year and $25 a year. So more expensive, but really $2 a month. That's not very much money. So a .tv domain might be an acceptable alternative. Lifechurch.tv is a perfect example of a church that does a lot of video, a lot of streaming, and so they use the .tv, and it makes perfect sense. In fact, I think their whole church is rebranded as Lifechurch.tv. Obviously, they know that it's Lifechurch TV, or they know that their church is just Life Church, but I think all their literature and everything says lifechurch.tv. So that's another possibility. If you wanted to go with .am or .fm, those are both country codes that maybe would say that your church does a lot of audio online. It's less than ideal, but if you're, for example, an African Methodist Episcopal Church, maybe .am to you might mean African Methodist. It's not perfect, but it could be something that seems clever to people. So think about that. Also think about if you want to drop the denominational branding from your name, it could be that First Baptist Church Orlando is taken, or seems a little long to you. But First Church Florida might be wide on open. So think through that. Now, you might be thinking, Paul, all these domains, it makes me uncomfortable. I've seen the Super Bowl commercials for that company that does domain names, and there's women in skimpy outfits, and I don't know that our church wants to support that. No problem. I didn't want to support it either. So what I use is a company that costs the same amount of money, has less, it doesn't have as many things that you have to click through to get to the domain, and their service seems really good. It's called Namecheap, NAMECHEAP.com. So that's something else I would do. I probably ought to mention that if you have had the domain and it just expired, you can usually reclaim it fairly quickly. So once a domain name expires, it's not that it immediately goes back into the ether where anyone else can get it. In fact, if your domain name has been around several years and you just forget to renew it, probably the very first thing that I would do is I would try and get it back. There might be an additional charge, but it's probably worth it. You usually have about 30 days to get a domain back before it goes back into the pool. And I would do that because one of the internet marketing strategies is to find a domain name that has lots of links pointing to it and repurpose that to point to your domain and thus giving you more authority. So you want to avoid having that happen if you absolutely can. I guess that also brings us to another point. How long should you keep a domain? When it comes down to it, domain names are kind of getting more and more valuable. .com that was easy to find 5 years ago is difficult to find today. So if you have a .com, usually it's about $10 a year to keep it up. Think about if you want to do that, because in some ways it's an asset. Now, think of it this way. If you own firstbaptistchurch.com, there are a lot of First Baptist churches out there. If you own firstbaptistchurch.com and you change your name to First Church Florida, and you might have very good reasons, well, all the other First Baptist churches might want that name. And in fact, on both sides of this, it's a good strategy to see if there are premium domains available. So if you don't find a domain you like, look to see if someone has that domain that they're willing to sell. It might be a little extra money, but I think church domains are more likely to be less expensive than domains that business people would use. So if it's got church in the name, that's likely less. It's likely going to be a less expensive domain than if it has marketing or money online or some sex term in it. It's less likely to be all that expensive. So keeping an old domain so that you can sell it to another church, and try not to gouge them, but it's okay to make back a a couple of years worth of your domain fees. I don't see any problem with selling a domain for $30 or $40 that you're not using anymore to another church. There are instances where there are companies that need domain names just as churches do, and their domain names that they want are ones that are owned by churches for specific campaigns. So if you had a buildingtogether.com domain that you use for a building program, it could be that there's a company called that's doing a building together campaign, and they would be willing to drop a couple of $1,000s your way to make that their domain. It's something worth thinking about. I guess on the same thinking, you could think, what is your tagline? So, like my church growing up, our tagline was "Love Spoken Here." And so maybe lovespokenhere.com is a good domain, or maybe lovespokenhere.org is a good domain. If you do go for that, make sure that you divide up all the words in all possible combinations, because there are some people that have gotten domains that really, they say something that people didn't intend them to say. So there's a company that sells pens, writing instruments, and they had this clever idea. They were going to be Pen Island. Stick those two words together and divide them in a different place. Say after the S. Yeah, it wasn't good. It was a mistake. There are tons of mistakes like that online where people divide words in different ways and it comes out not good. So a good example from my college days, when we were talking about how Greek was written in blocks, words smushed together to save space because paper was very expensive. Papyrus and vellum and such were very expensive. God is now here. If that is your tagline, you probably want to do something to make sure that it's clear that it's not God is nowhere. Because now, here, and nowhere, if they're smushed together and you're just dividing those or leaving to the person to divide them, now, here, and nowhere look remarkably the same. So that's a mistake that you can avoid if at all possible. So how about you? If you have any strategies that you've used to get domains for your church, I'd love to hear about them. These are just a few things off the top of my head that I've been thinking about as I've been going through all the possible domains and all the ways that we can be more influential online. So tomorrow I'm going to be talking about Epic, and that's something that is an idea for creating church. This will be recorded 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, again on churchtechcast.com. So Epic is all about how to make your services more engaging, and it's an idea that Lynn Sweet came up with, if you're familiar with him. He's people that I follow online. So until then, go out and change eternity.